Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Gupta and I welcome you all to Threads of Visual Exploration, Textiles and Allied Practices Part 2. So as you know that in this course what we are doing is we are looking into certain aspects of textiles and its relationship to different kinds of artisanal practices. I am Rajesh Gupta and I am presently teaching at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, specializing in fine arts and art history at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Kanpur, and my research interests entail theory and practice correlation or the interface, and then also textiles, artisanal histories and printmaking, to say a few. So in this course what we will do, we will look into some of the aspects that we have already covered in the Threads of Visual Exploration, Textiles and Allied Practices Part 1, and in this case what we will do is we will continue these discussions also along with practical demonstrations. So what we have covered so far in the earlier part of this course or in the part 1, that we have looked into a number of different kinds of textiles and different kinds of textiles from the Indian subcontinent, their historical aspects, and then also their significance in the community's culture and perhaps the social fabric of the nation. And of course, we have looked into textiles which come from the pre-independence era. So in a lot of ways we have looked into this textile or fabric culture of not just one nation but the entire Indian subcontinent. So what we have already seen that there are different kinds of textiles which have thrived in different parts of the Indian subcontinent among different textile making communities, and their association with the other artisanal forms of the Indian subcontinent, the ones which are in the same region with these textiles, as well as the artisanal forms they have traveled between distances. And all of those things we can see them to be intrinsically connected to each other, and that is the reason what we have already sort of flagged in this course, that how textiles is something that is not considered here to be exclusive, but we are thinking about textiles in a much more expansive way and its relationship to different kinds of artisanal forms, different ways of documentation, but also at the same time different ways in which textiles are perceived, as well as the way in which textiles are received. So here what we will do is we will continue this discussion and also look into the ways in which, like, the different visual forms they were incorporated in terms of understanding textiles, their significance in not only in terms of, like, human history, but also in economy and state politics and everything else. So here what we will do is we will again sort of, like, look into this textiles into a network of different kinds of ideas, different kinds of transactions. So perhaps that looking into the recent threads of scholarship, if I may call it, at least since 2000s, early 2000s, we see that textiles are repeatedly being placed in the network of different kinds of ideas. So that can certainly be how textiles are part of course, this networks of trade relation, networks of human relations, be it the ancient Silk Route to the oceanic networks that we have, and then also thinking about its significance when they were collected by different kinds of collectors all across the globe. And of course, that in terms of the Indian textiles, we definitely see that the network is not just about these transactions, but also its relationship to colonialism, and then also anti-colonial resistance and nation building as well. So these different kinds of ideas about networks that we have seen, at least since the early 2000s, we have seen them to be figured and featured not only in the scholarship, but also in a number of international exhibitions. And to continue this, we will also try to see the simultaneous this networks which perhaps go with this major strands of scholarship, and that is to think about the networks within the artisanal communities, networks within the systems of knowledge production based on this textiles or focusing around textiles. So, those are some of the issues we will be touching upon, those are some of the issues we will be sort of exploring throughout this course. Now, I guess that if we talk about networks, perhaps two of the primary interests in the scholarship today that we find, that would probably be the networks of the ideas of sustainability and how textile is closely connected to this idea, because textile is something, the entire production process that the mankind has evidenced since prehistoric times, and what we see there is how the different kinds of incorporation of material, then different techniques involved in gleaning fiber from the raw material, then eventually spinning, making them into yarn, and then weaving them into wearable fabric and everything. And then comes the dyeing, and of course that how different kinds of complex textile making processes are involved. So, from the beginning of history, we see this debate around how much of textile making we consider as handmade and how much of it we consider as something to do with the incorporation of different kinds of tools and mechanisms. So, this idea about having textiles which are man-made or machine-made is something that we see increasingly since the industrial revolution. However, in a field of textile making, we do not really see this issue to be something distinct to 19th century, but this debate is perhaps been going on since a long time. So, these are some of the ways in which we find that the way in which textile making has been continued over centuries or millennia had already presented ways in which we can engage with this questions about networks of making knowledge, how much of it we can consider as handmade and how much of it we can consider as to be done with the incorporation or intervention of different kinds of mechanisms. Now, the other ways in which we see that how this issues about sustainability and the networks of sustainability had intersected in textile is also because of the labor relations that we have today. And in various parts of the globe, especially in the global south, we find that the producer countries have increasingly faced the challenges about keeping up with the demands, and also thinking about the well-being of the artisans or the laborers who are in the factories or the production units making these textiles. So, these are some of the ideas we find them to be intersecting in textile making, whereas the other strand of perhaps a scholarship that also had textiles in its focus would probably be the Indian Ocean studies or the studies on the oceanic networks, in which we find that the ideas about region, the ideas about macro history is somewhat questioned, and then they are sort of reconfigured in the way in which the worldwide or the global networks were constructed, not only through trade, but also through the networks of travelers, also through the networks of artisans traveling across different regions. So, these are some of the things in which we find that in many different ways the textiles have been featured in the recent scholarly activities, curatorial activities and exhibitions around the idea of network. And as I have already mentioned, that we will also look into different kinds of networks in our study, but not just exclusively about this oceanic networks or the networks of transaction, but also in terms of the networks of the artisanal communities and how one thing leads to another. So, another thing that we will be doing as part of this course, and something that we have already sort of demonstrated in the threads of visual exploration in part 1, is to think about how do we think about this interrelation between theory and practice, which is also one of the key areas that I focus on in my own research. So, enlivening theory by practice is something that had always been very important to me, and here what I say is that how theory and practice, these two things, we consider them as two things, and how they are dependent one on one another. So, in one hand, if we do not have exposure to the practice, then we do not really know about the trial and error process, what is involved in practice, what is involved in terms of like understanding resistances from the material, resistances from techniques, and also our limitations of knowing. Now, if that is something we understand through practice, through involving with something over time, then theory is something in which we can understand that how certain parallels, if you will, or certain kind of patterns that runs through a different kind of practices can be stitched together to understand the core of certain kind of practices. And theory also helps in terms of understanding some of those key features of certain practices, as well as how those key features can be connected to other associated practices. So, this is something we find that how theory and practice, these two aspects of knowing, can be intrinsically connected, and these aspects can also be thought in terms of how they are contributing to one another. So, in this respect, what we also see is that how there are certain ways in which knowledge is produced, and how this different kinds of knowledge, different strands of knowledge, they can be enlivened when these two aspects are brought in conversation with one another. Now, in this case, we also see that the division, perhaps the way we understand today as theory and practice, this also perhaps is dependent on the way in which mind body division has been made in Western philosophy, and something we have been seeing at least since the 18th century to be incorporated in thought provocation in terms of like making of different kind of archival knowledge, and then also the way in which this idea of authoritarian knowledge is produced in the colonial archives. For that reason, this stark division between theory and practice is something that we find to be prominent in the field of craft studies, in the field of when textiles are documented or textiles are understood. Now, this division is something we will try to move out from that, and that is one of the reasons why we need to have more conversation between this theory and practice, to have certain kind of understanding of how things are in the real world, at the same time what are their underlying meanings. Now, the other aspects we can also think about here is that how history can be experienced through this different kind of practices. So, basically when we are talking about practices, we are talking about handling different kind of objects, materials, techniques in which our hands, our bodies and our brain are coming together in an action. So, our different kind of senses. So, senses in terms of when we are touching certain kind of objects or materials. So, our senses, the senses of sensation of touch, then smell, then also hearing, and also of course seeing, everything comes together. And then also when we follow certain kind of experiences of the dyers or weavers and so on, we always find that there are always this idea about tasting certain kind of solutions to find out its consistency or whether it is right for the process or not. A lot of times, as I have also heard from during my interviews with dyer Nageshwara Rao from Polavaram, he had said that to understand that whether the the alum, the common alum which is used in dyeing extensively in the Indian subcontinent, how whether this alum is natural or not. For that reason, they will take little bit of this alum, put it in their tongue, and see that, I mean, this particular kind of this tangy taste, and this taste sort of informs whether is this the material they are looking for or not. So, this kind of like different sensations are something that is very much important when we are engaging with materials, and through this kind of material engagement we can also understand certain aspects of history which is perhaps not been very clearly understood otherwise. So, these are some of the things we will be looking at when we talk about history through experience. So, in one hand we are looking at the history in the archival resources, and we are most definitely not denying the role of archives, documentation, object studies and visual analysis in this respect, but we are also considering experiencing certain kind of material processes to be a very important signifier that is involved in informing the idea of history. The other thing we will also focus on, which we have already spoke about in the earlier part of this course as well, and that is this immersive approach. And when we talk about immersive approach, it is again not disconnected from how we understand history through experience, but here by immersive approach we try to understand that how one thing can be looked at from different perspectives. So, perhaps looking at one aspect of textile making and then looking at through the archival resources, and then also looking at it through like the existing evidences, material evidences, objects and so on, and then also understanding aspects of them through our hands-on engagement. So, immersive approach is also something that we can say that how this is a approach, or how this is a way of knowledge generation or understanding certain aspects of this processes through a timely engagement. So, it is not something that we look at, we study and we forget, but we sort of engage with them over a certain period of time, and that is how this correlation between theory and practice can continue. So, in the week 1, what we will do is we will look into certain aspects of yarn and fabric dyeing, and in here what we will do is we will look into the how yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing, these two things are sort of done in history, but also in terms of how we understand their documentation, archival records, their significances in the human history, and of course that we are being region specific here, we are looking into all of this in relation to the Indian subcontinent, but also we will have practical demonstration to have further understanding of this. So, in a way that what we have already spoke about in terms of this theory practice correlation will also be implemented in the structure of this week and the later weeks as well. So, when we think about the history of yarn dyeing, when we think about the history of fabric dyeing, so what are the differences that we are talking about? So, yarn, when we talk about yarn, we are talking about the yarn that is spun, either hand spun, or today we can think about like how the spinning machines would be like spinning these yarns, and that can be from cotton, from linen, from hemp, silk, wool and so on. And we have already spoken about the differences between cotton and silk fibers. For example, something that is plant based fiber, cotton, linen, hemp, the cellulose fibers, and then we also have the protein fibers like silk and wool and etc. So, and of course, we are talking primarily about the natural fibers and not really the ones which are the synthetic ones. So, in terms of that, we see that yarn dyeing, when yarn dyeing we are addressing, so yarn is before it goes to the loom, if those are dyed and then they are sort of made prepared for the weaving. So, that is something we understand in terms of yarn dyeing, and when the undyed yarn is utilized in textile making, and then after the construction of the fabric they are dyed. So, that we are talking about that we address as the fabric dyeing. So, the fabric is the key in terms of understanding it, that I mean whether the construction of the fabric is done or not. Now, there are also different kinds of ways in which yarn is dyed and then incorporated in fabric making, or there are many different kinds of complexities those are involved in this process as well. Now, the thing is that I mean what we see here, that I mean in terms of the textual records, or in terms of like I mean different kinds of sculptures, because sculptures are something that is tangible, that is not malleable as textiles, that from very early part of the history, records of textile making, yarn dyeing and dyeing of fabric. However, as textile is something that is malleable and it has a life of its own as all of us, like the human beings. So, after a point we see that I mean it goes back to the earth. So, that is the reason a lot of ancient textiles we will not find them as object remains, but then the records of those textiles we can see them either in the textual records or in sculptures or architectural depictions, which are made in stone or much more sort of durable material, which can stay for a long time, unlike this malleable textiles. So, this is something we find them there, and then of course, we will see the practical demonstrations, as I have already mentioned, as part of this week. So, this is how we will continue discussing the aspects of yarn and fabric dyeing. Now, the thing is, here in this slide we have an image, and this comes from 1830s, and here we find this one image, and perhaps it was drawn in this provincial court of Murshidabad and in Bengal. And here what we see, there is this dark background, very unusual, and in which there are those white outlines which make the figure of a dyer at the center, and then there is a bamboo pole and supporting again like a bar of bamboo perhaps, and on which there are textiles which are hanging. Presumably we can understand that this is a dyer's workshop, and this comes as one of the 63 paintings depicting occupations, festivals and ships. And this was collected from Ishwari Prasad of Patna in the 1950s or 1940s. So, this remained in the and now of course, this is in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So, in this case, I mean in this particular painting, which was made in 1830s, that sort of gives us a sense of some of the basic components of a dyer's workshop. And what we see here, the dyer is seen almost at the center of this image and sieving the color, and sieving this color through this cotton sieve is something that is featured in many of this colonial documentation, and it's an act that we find that kind of like how knowledge is produced, and in which we also see that how this idea of sieving is something that is repeatedly incorporated in the idea of dyeing, fabric dyeing or yarn dyeing, that had been predominant in this colonial documentations. So, with that we will go little more into some of the aspects of fabric dyeing. And in terms of fabric dyeing, what we have here, that of course, that what we consider in terms of yarn and fabric dyeing, and how do we differentiate them from the printed and painted fabrics, because all of these fabrics can be considered as dyed fabrics or something that incorporates dyed yarn. But in that case, how do we understand that something I am considering as just yarn dyed or fabric dyed pieces, and then differentiating them from painted or printed fabrics, because painted and printed fabrics are something we will be talking about in the next weeks. So, next week and in the subsequent week. So, in that case, what I'd say in terms of this yarn dyeing and fabric dyeing, where we draw the boundaries is perhaps that when we are not incorporating tools for drawing or printing in the process of dyeing either yarn or fabric, then we are considering them as just dyed fabric or just dyed yarn. So, it does not imply that the patterns or different kind of variations are not created in this case. So, for example, if we are utilizing different the potentials of yarn and fabric to themselves for making different kinds of patterns, ornamentations. So, that can certainly go into this category of yarn dyeing or fabric dyeing. However, if specific tools used for painting, drawing or printing are not incorporated in this process, then we are not considering them as painted or printed fabrics. Now, what kind of different variations do we see in terms of how yarn dyeing is done and then how that is featured in textiles. So, the primary thing that we find there is plain woven fabric. So, if yarn is dyed and then that is arranged in the loom and woven into a piece of fabric, and the fabrics that we see them on a very regular basis to have just one plain color or whatever color they are in. So, that is something that we find them to be the plain woven fabric. Then we also have the resist dyed yarn and fabric. So, in terms of the resist dyed yarn, in which what happens is we are having the yarns, and before we dye them we are incorporating some kind of resist material that can be thread, and today there are many kind of plastic materials which are also used for resisting. Now, the resist, it sort of stops the color from penetrating into particular parts of the yarn, and that is how we can create patterns. This is the basic of making ikat fabrics, in which we see how this pattern making is incorporated and how pattern making is done by sort of utilizing this potential of the fiber itself and not really incorporating any other tools, but just other undyed yarn for tying parts of the yarn and dipping them into the color. Now, the similar kind of thing we can also understand when we talk about the dyed fabrics. So, for example, if the fabric is already constructed, then if the parts of the fabric is dyed with thread or different kinds of material, or if those are folded and then sort of dipped in the dye. So, in that case as well, we see that how patterns are created. In this case, the resisting method is something that is used. Now, perhaps I can also mention that when there are also other kinds of resists which we will see in terms of how the resist printed fabrics are created. So, I am making a differentiation between the resist printed fabrics and the fabrics which only utilize yarn material for making those resists. So, these are the ways in which we can see these differences. Then we also see how yarn is also used in terms of this extra weft weaving. So, different colored yarns, and then they are put together in an arrangement for making different kinds of patterns. So, it can be one of the simplest ways in which we can understand that is through extra weft weaving or the checkered motifs and so on. And then also how dyed yarn is then incorporated in the form of embroidery. So, there is already a pre-made fabric, and then embroidery is something we are using different kinds of threads with a needle and making ornamentations or fabric on a pre-made surface. So, the embroidery is something that is not really added when the construction of the fabric is on, which is already conveyed in the other in the earlier part of the course. Now, the other thing we also find very curiously is about the dyed fiber. So, and using of dyed fiber is something that we find increasingly in the contemporary art, and we will look into that as part of our exploration of dyed yarn and dyed fabric. There are different kinds of the correlation between them, as well as how one thing is they have certain kind of context, but also at the same time that how one thing develops in relation to different kind of societal and political cultural engagements. So, we will continue this discussion more in the next lecture. Thank you.